Humans have a profound need to make sense of our experience, and one of the primary ways we do that is through stories. When we think we're responding to a person, experience, or feeling, what we're usually really responding to is the story we're telling ourselves about that experience. And when we confuse interpretation with reality, we give our stories a degree of power and influence over us they don't deserve. My name is Jenn Swanson, and I love helping people develop fresh insight into the stories that guide their lives. Because insight brings choice, and choice empowers and frees. What stories we tell to interpret our experience matter. Doing a better job of interpreting what's going on around and inside us can make for a better life and a better world. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Personal Story Coach podcast. Today on the podcast, I am really pleased to have my first interview, and my first interviewee is Jenn Swanson. Jenn is a pastor. She is a coach who works with people around mindset. She is a YouTuber. She has a channel that's Careers by Jenn, and she also happens to be married to me. So I wanted to have Jenn on as my first guest on the podcast, and today she is going to be talking about work. That's her area, employment, and some of the issues that maybe young men in particular are encountering in the workplace these days. So without further ado, here's my interview with Jenn Swanson. Okay, here we go. The first interview on the Personal Story Coach podcast, and I am pleased to welcome my partner Jenn here today. Welcome, Jenn.
Thank you.
All of the rest of my interviews will be on StreamYard. We'll be in two different boxes, but since we live in the same house, contemplated maybe, having one person in one room and one person in the other. Decided in the end we just do it this way. So thank you for doing this. Thanks for being my first guest.
My pleasure.
Why don't we start off by you telling us what you do?
Oh my goodness, what do? I do many things. One of the things that I'm working on right now is my career coaching and working with career topics on a YouTube channel. I have a podcast or two out there, some of which you will hear Scott's voice on, some of the back episodes, and I also work in the church as well. So many things.
One of the themes in the Personal Story Coach program, and the first one I'm profiling, is fear.
Mm-hmm.
Fear is a tricky thing. A lot of guys don't want to admit to having fear. So the fact that they're even watching this may be kind of a tender thing. I don't know. Mm-hmm. But it strikes me that there are a lot of ways that fear and work and a professional life can overlap. So why don't we start at the beginning with choosing a career? What do you have to say about the relationship between men choosing what they want to do with their life in terms of their career and how fear might fit into that?
Well, the hard thing about it is that fear drives almost everything in many ways. And so there's a lot of fear around, will I make the right choice? Will my family be pleased? Will I make enough money? Will I have enough status? Will I be able to earn what I want to earn to be able to do the things that I want to do? So there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of fear around just making that choice. And the thing is that now we don't have to make one choice. We can have multiple careers. So it shouldn't be as terrifying as it seems to be, but it still is because of that fear of failure, I think.
And what do you advise people who are struggling with this fear of failure or fear of not measuring up to their parents or their community's expectations or any of the other things you've named? How do you recommend that people go about addressing some of those things so they can make a good decision?
Well, the problem is if you're doing something because it's someone else's expectation or someone else's agenda, it's not going to end well. You're going to end up in, 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20 years unhappy because this wasn't something that you chose to do. And I've actually met people who were in the middle of doing a degree because someone else said you should be X or you should do X, and they're miserable. And so life is too short for that. So I talk a lot about what is it, uncover what it is that the person would prefer to do if they didn't have any of these external pressures on them. And we talk about that, and we dig into a little bit about what brings you joy, what lights you up, what would you love to do, what do you like to do for fun, and then what elements of that can you bring into what it is you're doing. There's actually a process that the Harvard Business School recommends called 7 Stories. And have you heard of it? It's
I have, yeah, but
a process whereby you take 25 accomplishments that you've had in your life, and they can be from childhood, from teenagehood, from adulthood, 25 things, and you write it out on a piece of paper. And things that have made you feel good and brought meaning to you. And then what you do is you rank them in order of, and that takes time. So you rank them in order of which ones are the most important or the most powerful or have meant the most to you in your life. And then after you've got them ranked, you keep the top 7 and you get rid of the rest. And then with those 7 accomplishments, you write about a 1-paragraph story with great detail about each one as to why, what skills, what things did you learn, what was exciting about this accomplishment, and write 7 stories. And then you get out your highlighter, this takes a while, and you go through and you find all the keywords or the things the patterns, whatever you can see in those 7 stories. And that might give you a clue. So if you see, if you've done a lot with video, you might want to do something with videography. If you see the word organized in there, you might want to think about doing something where you're organizing, data or people or whatever it is. So you go through and you find the thread. And then the last step, which often we don't talk about, is making a list of 200 opportunities. Just as an exercise to let you know that you don't have to do the top 3 that everybody thinks of when they think of that subject. So it takes a while, but it's a really good process.
And so when people complete that process, they have a better idea of the kinds of things that they might find joy and pleasure in doing.
Yeah, exactly.
Might find rewarding.
Yeah.
Okay. How do you advise people around whatever constraints they might come up against? So, for example, education can be really expensive in this day and age. There's an awful lot of young people who have degrees and debt, and they're really not any much better of a position in terms of their employability and their ability to pay off that debt. There could be other barriers in the way. I don't know, but how do you advise people, or how do you help people work through the things that might be getting in the way of them fulfilling their dreams?
I think I like to look at it holistically, and I like to say, what else do you like to do besides work? You're going to be at work for a huge portion of your life if you're working full time. What else do you like to do? And what do you need in order to be able to do all of those things? And then the other thing is how much time, effort, energy, and money do you want to be putting into this? What have you got as available resources? And I have one client I was talking to who absolutely hated university. She did a degree. She started another degree. She didn't want to continue with this degree, and she's really struggling with, do I finish it just to have the piece of paper to then get the job I want? Or is there something else that you could learn, you could gain, you could have experience in that would help you? The degree it's good. It's not the only way, though. There's so many ways to advance and to go forward. So I think you have to, before you slot yourself in, which is why I think it's terrible that they make teenagers choose a career path so early, is what do you need? for the rest of your life, not just for your job, before we start going down the path of exactly what.
And you said a few minutes ago that we don't, the way our parents or grandparents did, we don't tend to stay in a job for our entire career. We do tend to move around. Talk about when it comes to changing a career and where fear might fit in around that for people.
Yeah, well, it can be scary to step out and do something new, right? When you risk something, it can be fearful. You can be afraid because it's comfortable sometimes. You know what to do.
The golden handcuffs.
It's easy. It's comfortable. Everybody knows you. You know what to do. You don't have to think so much. You don't have to stretch. And so taking that step out to try something new can be very scary. And then you start to have all the self-doubts, right? So do I have enough skill? Do I have enough knowledge? Do I have enough energy? Because it's exhausting to learn something new. And so often we're talking about your mindset when I'm doing that kind of work. It's, why do you want to do this? You have to know why. Are you bored? Could you be doing something more? Are you looking for purpose? What's the reason that you want to make a move in the first place? Unless you're forced to. Are you on the road to burnout? Are you burned out? So what's the reason why you want to make the move? And then how can we work with you to get you there?
Simon Sinek, that famous talk about know your why.
Start with why.
Start with why. So yeah, if you don't know about that, you can look him up on YouTube. And my notes just disappeared. Look at that.
I keep looking at the microphone and forgetting to look at the camera.
There were words on that page, and now there are none.
Oh.
Okay.
Don't be afraid.
That's fine. I'm thinking of a young fellow in our family, 30-something, who was in one career, decided for a bunch of reasons to move in another direction. I don't think there was family pressure around that. I think that was a complete sort of authentic, original decision that he made, and got a fair ways down the path of training for that career, and then discovered that this is actually not what he wanted to be doing. You mentioned a few minutes ago about people who are responding to external pressures and may feel fear not to do something or to go down a particular path. What happens for people when they've committed to something and then they discover that it's not the right thing? Maybe they're not actually doing that thing yet. Seth Godin talks about ignore sunk costs, right? Like if it's not the right thing, get out. Yeah. But what are your thoughts about that?
That's a hard one. I used to teach college for a couple of decades, and every once in a while there would be a student who had committed to the program who realized sometimes it was partway through the in-class training, and sometimes it was out in the hospitals on the practicum, which was worse, when they discovered that this just was not for them. And there's a lot of guilt, there's a lot of shame, there's a lot of regret. Never mind the external, parental units paid for this, or I got a loan and now I'm going to still have to pay for it, etc., etc. But I think it takes bravery. I think it's very courageous to say, I don't like this and I'm going to be miserable and I'm not going to be the person I want to be if I get stuck in this rut of a career and have to be here for the next however many years. And this person that you were talking about, I think it's quite courageous and quite brave. And I don't think it's wasted. I think everything that's you learn, you take with you and you build on it in the next thing that you want to do. But, people want to twist it as, oh, you didn't bother finishing. And I always said to those students, good for you for figuring this out now and not spending any more time doing this thing that you're going to come to hate and resent and then be miserable about.
Yeah.
So I think it's a brave move to figure that out. And the good thing is there are so many things out there that you can move on and you can take what you learned with you.
Yeah. This is, starting to touch onto the beginnings of a stereotype, but I wonder if you notice in younger folks these days, say under 40, people feeling more freedom around what they're going to do in terms of employment, feeling less constrained about having to stick with something just because. What do you notice about that?
Yeah, there is a lot out there, and with the gig economy and with piecework, people can pick something up. There are people driving for Uber or one of those food delivery things to supplement a job that doesn't pay as well if they have to. There's a lot of online work, so people are able to find things and move around until they get a job that's the right job for them. So if it's a case like, do you need money? Then you can go find something that will get you that. It might not meet the perfect fit, but then you can bide your time and get some skills and do some upgrades and then find something that is the right fit. So I think there's more opportunity now. It used to be, you went into a career and you were expected to stay there until you got your watch.
Right. That's even older than our generation,
I know.
though, right? Like we're Gen Xers, and that feels more like kind of a boomer.
It is, but there's still a lot of boomers.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Running the shows right now.
Yeah.
So we're slowly shifting, and it's slowly becoming a lot more common to job hop. And to job hop with a purpose is fine. If you're job hopping just because you're testing a bunch of stuff out, that works for a while. It doesn't look great on a resume if you're not staying for at least a year or two. But there's a lot of testing out of careers going on, and I think it's a good thing. So
this opens up a path, and I don't know how far down this we want to go, but I'm thinking with everything that's happening in terms of AI, all the jobs that are disappearing, right? We're in the midst of this shift, and people compare it to the Industrial Revolution, where over a fairly short period of time, a whole bunch of jobs that used to exist disappeared and a whole bunch of new ones came online. Now people talk about the end of work as everything gets automated and robots take over doing all these things. What do you see as the future of work?
Yeah, that's a good question. I interviewed somebody not too long ago about that. And I'm trying to remember all the things she said because it was quite phenomenal. But I think it stuff always has rotated. There used to be farming years and years ago. That used to be the thing. And things have shifted and changed as technologies move and change. I think some things will disappear, but there's so much more opportunity. There's way more opportunity online now than there was when we started out, right, for work. Yeah. So I think we have to reimagine what this all looks like. And there are a lot of people going into business for themselves, and there are people going back to things that maybe they shifted away from. It's very, very difficult to get a tradesperson right now.
Yeah.
And the trade schools are looking for students, and they're not filling the classes because people are have shifted in a different direction. So I'm hoping it comes back around because we're always going to need plumbers and electricians and people to actually do that kind of technical work. So I think it just goes and shifts and it rotates, and it's very interesting to see what's going to happen next.
Mm-hmm. Talk for a little bit about on the job and where fear can show up on the job. So I'm thinking now interpersonal relations, both with colleagues, with supervisors, being evaluated, how we respond to that, promotions.
Questions.
Well, yeah. There's this whole thing about, so we talked about getting into the job and what happens when you're in your job and you want to get out maybe into something else. Mm-hmm. But for people who are into something and they're finding in the interactions with different people places where they're struggling, and fear may be a part of what's going on in that for them.
Yeah, I guess every workplace has its own culture and its own set of rules and its own way of being, And some of them are healthy and some of them are not so healthy. So it depends on the culture of the workplace, whether you're able to have good relationships with people and have conversations honestly, or if you're watching your back and you're worried that, you know, somebody's going to rat you out for something, which is certainly the case in some workplaces. So first of all, the culture makes a difference. And I'm trying to think of what you asked me 15 questions at once. So, but I think sometimes there is fear around not saying, you know, saying the right thing, not saying the wrong thing. It depends on who your boss or your manager, your supervisor is, and whether or not you have a good relationship with them, as to whether you're comfortable enough to speak up when there's something wrong, to go up the chain of command if you need to. I remember talking to one fellow. I was doing facilitating a workshop in a workplace that was predominantly male. And I remember this young guy followed me out to my car to ask me more questions because he was working in a place where he was being bullied. It was a toxic workplace. And he didn't know what to do next because he couldn't go to anybody else in the organization. And so the next step was human rights. And that was a whole can of worms. And if you open that can of worms, you know, he was afraid for his physical well-being in that workplace. And I just felt for him because there isn't a whole lot you can do except leave. But the problem is if you leave, nothing has changed in that workplace. And then the next person will end up being the victim. So do you have the fortitude to speak up? Which I would hope that there would be people that would be helpful in that realm, but not in every workplace. When it comes to being physically afraid, that's a whole different thing than having some limiting belief within yourself that makes you afraid to speak up because you're shy, or that's a different thing than feeling threatened in a workplace where there is workplace bullying, and those schoolyard bullies grow up to be grown-up bullies, and it's a real thing.
For that other category, talk a little bit about soft skills. First of all, what's your sense of how well this generation does with that, if you can generalize that broadly? And for those people who think they maybe don't have the skills that would help them in these interpersonal situations, not where there's huge power differentials or where they're being bullied or in a toxic environment, for people who do feel like they're short on those skills, where can they go?
Well, the first thing, when you say this generation, most workplaces, not all, but many workplaces are intergenerational right now. So if we're not thinking about that, we're not aware of that, then it can be more difficult to communicate because, you know, somebody might want a long process and somebody might want instant results, and there's different ways of communicating generationally. And if you're not aware of that, that can cause problems. There are all sorts of places people can go to learn soft skills. There's courses online, there's classes you can take. If it's public speaking, there's always groups like Toastmasters, that kind of thing. You can get a coach. There are people that can help you with soft skills. It's the awareness that's a little more difficult to draw out of people. It might be the way you're communicating that's the source of conflict rather than anything else. So sometimes it's, how are you framing that question? How are you bringing that feedback to that person? Are you doing it in the best possible way to have a decent conversation, or are you turning it into a confrontation? Communication has always been a huge piece of it, and not everybody is being trained in communication and good communication skills.
I'll link in the show notes to a couple of books and maybe a few episodes of your podcast that focus on this subject as well.
Great.
Yeah. Why don't you tell us about what you are doing in your working with people around work?
I do have a small coaching practice, 2 or 3 spaces at a time, and I enjoy helping people figure out what they want to do, how to get the job, how to love their work, how to advance their career, any of those topics. And I was doing a podcast for 10 years. I'm still sort of doing it a little bit. I've started up again, but then I jumped onto YouTube just for fun to see that would get more people watching and learning the content. So I have a Careers by Jenn with 2 N's YouTube channel and Instagram and the podcasts. And recently I started a podcast about career burnout. That's going to be a little short, small podcast, but it's all about identifying the signs of like finding out why people burn out in the first place, knowing the signs, and then figuring out what to do with it.
When you started all those years ago, it was a very different economy, and get the job, that first part of what you were doing was a real thing back then. Now, not so much. There's an awful lot of jobs that seem to be out there. Whether they're the right ones or not is another question. But so you've gone more from helping people with cover letters and resumes, although you still do a little bit of that, but you're more into mindset and big vision and big dreams and that kind of stuff now.
Yeah, because there is a lot of information out there on how to write a resume. People still appreciate that information, but there is a lot of that out there, and oftentimes they're not requiring cover letters. Oftentimes people are getting jobs just because they show up on time and have a resume in hand and are able to have an interview. There are many times that I've talked to people where the interview was not really a full-on interview. It's very interesting. Depends on the industry and the job, but there's a lack of workers in many industries right now, and so there's quite a bit of work to choose from.
Kind of a buyer's market.
It's kind of a buyer's market. But then, I enjoy the mindset stuff. I enjoy figuring out why people are getting in their own way and not making the moves or not stepping out. What is that about, and how can we help unpack that?
I was watching it. It's a bit of an aside, but I was watching a video the other day, an old video by, do you know who Zig Ziglar is?
Mm-hmm,
yeah,
absolutely.
Old video that's quite funny. He's recounting this story of meeting a woman backstage before a talk of his, and she was absolutely furious because everybody at work was so terrible and so horrible, and it was such a toxic workplace. And so the story is about how he gets her to start thinking in terms of what is good about her job and how thinking in that way begins to shift everything. Of course, her first response is, there's nothing good about my job. And he says, well, do they pay you? She said, well, yeah, they pay me. Okay. Do they pay you reasonably well? Okay. Do you like being paid? Well, there's one thing you like about your job. And over the course of this interaction with her, 2 interactions with her actually, she comes to really, really enjoy her job. And the funniest part is she can't believe how much nicer the people at work have all gotten.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So yeah, we'll put that link in the show notes as well.
That reminds me, if I can tell another story. That reminds me of the story of an experiment that was done with chambermaids, housekeepers in hotels a few years ago, where they talked to them about their well-being, their health, and their wellness. And they asked them a bunch of questions. And, I don't get any exercise. I don't do this. I don't do that. And then they disclosed to these people that everything they were doing during their day was exercise. They were bending, they were pushing carts, they were, reaching down, they were doing all this stuff. Making beds, doing all these things. And as a result of just thinking, reframing and thinking of their work as exercise, they started to feel healthier, lose weight, even some of them. It was amazing. It made such a big difference to how they perceived their job.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the science is showing us this, and we're finding this in our own work, that mindset really is at the core of so much. And, it's not to say that there aren't systemic things going on that make life difficult and more difficult for some people than others, and how we think about things. One of the things I say all the time is, when there's something going on that you don't like, you can either change the thing you don't like, or you can change the way you relate to it. And that second one is this mindset thing we're talking about.
Yeah, and I always say, don't believe everything you think.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Any last parting thoughts around fear and work? We didn't really get into the whole gender thing around how this might be different for men than for women, for people who identify as men. There's some cultural things around work and the importance of work and the place of work, which, I mean, I think that's evening out a little bit, but my sense is there still is something for a lot of guys around feeling the need to provide. Mm-hmm. And the shame that comes with not being able to do that, and then how that gets turned around in negative ways.
And it's not a even playing field in so many ways for gender. Depending on who you're talking about, there's pay inequity. That's a whole other podcast. I tell you. But yeah, there's a lot of challenges that are still dependent on who you are and what the culture of the place is that you're working in. It's not a level playing field for men or women or people of color or
and the way culture, and I'm not thinking just in terms of ethnic culture now, but regional culture, mm-hmm. religious cultures, mm-hmm. organizational cultures, family cultures, the way all of these things come to bear on what our expectations are, and therefore whether our expectations are likely to get met mm-hmm. or not. It's incredibly complex, and things are changing. And a lot of those changes are good, I mm-hmm. think, and they are difficult for a lot of people.
Yeah, and I think this is part of why when you go to a job interview, you also need to be interviewing them to see if the culture of the company fits with your values and your beliefs and your ethos. Because if it's not a good fit in that way, you're not going to be happy there either. You know, there's a furniture company that has prayer meetings every day for their staff. Well, if that's not your thing, you probably don't want to work there. So it's finding out more about the company and doing your industry research before you get to the interview so that you can ask good questions to figure out if this place is indeed for you.
I guess that's part of being in a buyer's market is it's not just the employer who's interviewing the prospective employee.
Right. Yeah, you have some choice, especially if you've got a lot of interviews. If you've gotten yourself into a position where you have multiple interviews, then you can have a choice, which is a good
thing. Yeah, great. Jenn Swanson, thank you so much for being my first guest on the Personal Story Coach podcast.
Thank you. It's an honor.
Yeah, and so we're going to link in the show notes to your website and a couple of the videos that you've made over the years that pertain to what we've talked about, and a few other resources for people. And we'll see you in, a few minutes as soon as I turn the camera off.
Okay, sounds good. Right. Thank you.
Bye. Well, there you go. That was my interview with Jenn. Thanks so much, Jenn, for coming on and doing this with me. I'm going to put a link in the show notes to where you can find Jenn's work, where you can connect with her, as well as some other information and links that came up in this interview. Thanks very much for listening. As you know, you can support this podcast and the work I'm doing by liking this podcast, commenting on it, sharing it. If you're watching it on YouTube, comment on it, like it there. You can subscribe to the podcast, subscribe to the YouTube channel, anything like that will help to get the word out there about what I'm doing. Thanks very much. We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Personal Story Coach podcast. What are you taking away with you that can help you change the way you think about your life? I help people, mostly men, gain insight into their current stories and practice telling ones that better align with their purpose and principles. If you'd like to know more about what I'm working on, go to personalstorycoach.com. There you can subscribe to my blog, see my menu of offerings, and sign up for my mailing list. Until next time.